The goal of therapy is to be able to tolerate the full range of our feelings, no matter how painful. This, however, is easier said than done, and we human beings find all sorts of ways to avoid those painful feelings. We soothe ourselves with drugs, with alcohol, with overwork, over-exercise, overeating, undereating, shopping to excess. Really, there's an infinite variety of ways in which we can distract ourselves from the pain we hold within. Each of these forms of distraction designed to take us away from the pain inside. Each of these forms of distractions brings suffering into our life. Suffering in the form of the neglect of the pain that festers within. Suffering in the form of the damage we do to our bodies in order to distract ourselves. This damage can come in the form of cirrhosis, in the form of exhaustion, in the form of metabolic imbalance, in the form of hypertension, in the form of elevated heart rate. Really, anything we do to excess designed to keep us from being aware of what we feel carries within it the capacity to damage our bodies. And in a way, it's a calculated risk which we unconsciously take, because on some level we say, well, bad as it may be to anesthetize ourselves in this way, it sure feels a lot better than getting in touch with our pain. More paradoxically, the ways in which we anesthetize ourselves, if they carry tremendous risk of long-term damage, often they permit us to survive the moment simply by taking us away from that pain. And so, damaging as it may be to abuse drugs and alcohol, damaging as it may be to over-exercise or overwork, damaging as it may be to undereat or overeat, those strategies in the short term afford us some relief by occupying our minds and thus our bodies in another way. Unfortunately, these strategies for short-term survival often carry long-term implications. And so we may survive the psychic pain of the moment, but at the end of the day, do ourselves in. The way out of suffering strange as it may seem, is to direct our attention toward the pain within. If suffering is the consequence of turning away from our pain in the form of these ways of soothing ourselves, or even if it's simply a matter of denial, the way out of that suffering is to turn toward that reservoir of emotion we can't stand to bring to our mind. And so, rather than redirect our mind away, we turn our mind toward that reservoir of pain, and rather than run off to the distance, stepping as far away from the shore as we can, leaving it behind us in the far receding distance, we turn toward the edge and put in our toe and begin to feel the cold and the wet. And so, turning toward that reservoir of pain permits us to avoid all those optional strategies that leave the pain unknown and that cause unnecessary damage. But it's not simply a matter of wading into the pain, and it certainly isn't a matter of rushing and diving in, which, like jumping into the river in winter, can shock our system and keep us from ever coming back. We want to be mindful of the way we enter in. We want to be careful, we want to be cautious, and optimally, we want to do it with the help of a professional, someone who can stand by us as we gaze into the waters, someone who at times will cautiously edge us forth, someone who at times will carefully follow after. But however we do it, we want to do it with awareness. Awareness of the magnitude of the process of entry. Awareness of the difficulty of traversing the currents. Awareness of the process of moving through and coming out. Awareness of the delicacy and intensity of the whole. One of the most useful tools to initiate this process, one of the most useful tools to sustain and come through, is the tool of observation taught by meditation. Meditation teaches us to witness our experience, to witness the sensations that arise in the body, to witness the feelings that emerge in the heart, to witness the thoughts that arise in the mind. Meditation teaches us to look as if from a distance, observing what presents without making it ourselves, observing it as if from another place altogether, observing its occurrence without ascribing cause. I often find, as I think about the process of meditation, I often find that I think about Melville's Moby Dick, about the seaman perched in the crow's nest, gazing out over the sea, looking for that spout that signals the great whale. Although that seaman is of the crew, and although that crow's nest is of the ship, both are above and beyond the action below, whence they can see the comings and goings without themselves being caught up in the fray. And so when we meditate, we move into that part of the mind from which we can watch the activity within. We move into that part of the mind that witnesses the body, that feels the nerves fire in the calf or the thigh. We move into that part of the brain that witnesses the feelings, those expressions of mood that signal our frame of mind. We witness in this part of the brain the thoughts that arise, informing us of the inflections of our intellectual bendings. And so we get to know what we feel in our bodies. And so we get to know what we feel in our hearts. And so we get to know what we think in our minds, without simply being those physical sensations, without simply being those mood-based emotions, without simply being those idea-based reflections. We find a space within that is of the body and yet apart. We find a space that is of the heart but apart. We find a space that is of the mind but apart, like that crow's nest up above, we find that place from which we can observe the body, the heart, and the mind without simply being the sum total of each. And so we create a space through the meditative process that allows us to experience the way we experience. That allows us to have an experience of our physical, emotional, and intellectual parts. And yet, at the same time, to feel larger than each. And this sense of space, the spaciousness of observation, permits us to inquire into the qualities of each, permits us to explore what we might do differently, permits us to find options for new ways of being. That sensation in my leg feels this way when I do this, that way when I do that. Well, what if I do this? That mood in my heart seems to occur in these moments. Well, what if I act differently? Or think in a new way? Perhaps my mood will lift, my feelings will shift. Perhaps I'll find a new way of coming to feel. And perhaps if I think of this idea from that point of view, or that idea from this point of view, perhaps I'll find a new way of analyzing the problem. Perhaps I'll find a new way of deriving meaning and answer. And so, the observational power that comes with meditation affords us a perspective into the nature of ourself, affords us an insight into the functioning of ourselves, our physical self, our emotional self, our intellectual self as well. That makes possible a shaking loose of the sense of fixation. Makes it possible to find new ways to sense and feel and think. Makes it possible to discover options for a higher quality of life. Makes it possible to discover opportunity for change. When we enter into the therapeutic process, we want to be able to cultivate the capacity to observe, which allows us to inquire into how we're put together, and makes it possible to turn our attention to the reservoir of pain. So many of us spend so much of our lives running quickly away from. And so with the skill to observe and reflect, we can turn toward that reservoir and gently wade in, hopefully accompanied by a therapeutic guide next to, in front of us, or often behind, but there with us on the journey within, helping us enter, helping us cross, helping us emerge intact on the other side.